Hey y'all, and welcome to a course on Octavia Butler. I didn't know there were so many Butlerites out there. I didn't know there were so many people who are interested in talking and thinking about her work, and I am happy to welcome you to a lecture and teaching series on Octavia Butler. I am Dr. Brianna Whiteside. I am a former tenure-track English professor and Butler scholar. I wrote my master's thesis on Butler, my dissertation on Butler. I was on fellowship at the Huntington Library to study Butler's archive, and every summer that I lived on the West Coast, I lived in Pasadena because I was studying Butler's work at the Huntington Library. As an academic, I also created tons of specialized courses at the university level for study on Butler. And so I want to just start to give you this information, and let's create some chat surrounding her. I know that sometimes academics can be hard to reach. We keep things behind the academic paywall and sometimes inside of the ivory tower, but I've always wanted to be a public intellectual, so I'm super excited to teach you publicly. All right, so in this video, I'm going to introduce you to the Butler canon. I know there are a lot of people who are new to her work and a lot of people who want to know the best way to begin to read her work to make sense of what she was actually doing. And so this video is for you if you're interested in that. So if you are new to Butler's work and you want to get into it, I always tell people to read Kindred. Here you go. If this title sounds familiar, it's because Hulu did have a series entitled Kindred where they were trying to adapt this book to the screen. Now, it was short-lived. I don't know why. I have some theories why, but it didn't make it, and so people don't really know what happened. But this is the gateway book. If you don't think you like Butler, if you don't think you like science fiction, we may no longer be in that moment in culture now. But if you want to get into her body of work, you want to start to read Kindred. When I am teaching Butler's canon in an academic classroom, I put Kindred first because it sucks readers in. Y'all, the prologue literally reads, "I lost an arm on my last trip home, my left arm." That's the first sentence. Man, what do you mean you lost an arm? What do you mean your last trip home? What trip? And why were you there? These are the questions that Kindred begins to deal with. It asks you to think about, what would you do if you were a Black person living in America today, but was snatched back to the antebellum Maryland, and you were a slave in that moment? What would you do to keep your lineage alive to survive? This is what Kindred is all about. Now, in the video that is circulating now, I mentioned that Butler never sought to write series, but she did write 2 standalone novels. And the second standalone novel is Fledgling. This is a vampire novel for people who are interested in vampirism. But on deeper levels, this is a novel about what happens when Black people have been displaced and actually experience different forms of violence that cause them to suffer from amnesia. How do you survive? How do you live? This protagonist in this book, Shori Matthews, is an experimental vampire. She's one of the only vampires who can daywalk because historically vampires have been white. And so these people who are members of the vampire community launch a series of attacks, completely annihilate her family. And she has to kind of avenge their death by relearning who she is, learning the law, learning the culture, all of the things. If you have access to an academic library, you can look up one of my recent articles on this book called Sites of Resistance. And I walk you through how she actually begins to heal from this injustice by visiting various sites that were once sites of trauma, but then she repurposes them to heal. And so if you're interested in that, it was released by the journal FemSpec. Now, if you're not interested in reading long form books, you can grab Butler's Bloodchild and Other Stories. This is her collection of short stories. She wrote 7 short stories and 2 essays. And when I am teaching Butler's work, I like to focus on speech sounds. There's something that happens in the earth where it snatches people's ability to communicate over barriers. And so some people can only communicate via gesture, some have speech, and it's a very fascinating thing because it shows the breakdown of humanity when we cannot communicate over barriers. The next short story that I absolutely love that's crazy is The Evening and the Morning and the Night. The Evening and the Morning and the Night really walks you through this idea that the government has produced a virus inside of a lab. And the virus, they've marketed it as a cancer treatment. The people who take the cancer treatment, their offspring are born with this disease called DGD disease, which prompts people to start digging themselves out of their skin. It's like dissociation. They try to dig out of their skin because they don't see this, or I'm not dissociation, depersonalization. They don't see their bodies as a part of themselves. And so they fight hard to try to get out of their bodies and things of that nature. But it is a result of the government producing a virus. Or maybe it's not a virus, maybe it's a vaccine, but whatever it is, the consequences land on the offspring of people who took the cancer vaccine. Now, let's get into this Butler series. This is where she spent majority of her time in series writing. Now, if you want to read Butler's series, first series you want to look at is it was published in 2008, a few years after her death, and they narratively constructed this book to reflect the logical flow of the stories. But Butler wrote all of the stories out of order in this book. So say, for instance, Pattern Master is the last book of the Patternist series, but it is the first book she ever wrote. And the reason why it is the last book of the series is because of the narrative flow of the entire Patternist series. So since you cannot get the Seed to Harvest book anymore, and you can get standalone copies of the Patternist series, these are the books you want to grab. First and foremost, you want to get Wild Seed, WILDSEED, the 2 words. That book is set in 1680. So this series, I argue, actually gives us 4 centuries. It spans 4 centuries. And so you want to start with Wild Seed. It starts in West Africa. And then you want to move to Mind of My Mind. Fascinatingly, Mind of My Mind deals with telepathy. It also deals with brain hacking, and it also eerily nods to this present moment that we are in with AI, where people are partnering in a lot of ways with artificial intelligence, and it kind of shows you some of the impacts of that. All right, so once you move from Mind of My Mind, you will notice that there is a gap. Survivor is the gap. This book is out of print. You could probably get some collector's items like I did, or you can go to the library. Survivor takes place in space. It is the direct result of what happened in Mind of My Mind. Some people in Mind of My Mind, they have telepathy, or what Butler calls psionic ability, that they can brain to brain communicate, which leaves other people who don't have that ability, those humans, it leaves them out and it makes them slaves. They are enslaved to the Patternist community. And so Survivor kind of looks at their lives once they're in space, because they think, hey, if we leave Earth, we're going to be free of the Patternists. Butler shows you the impact of this moment in AI culture that we're in, which I argue. She shows the impact on humanity. As I said, there are some PDFs floating around online. This book is at libraries, and if you have access to an academic library, you can look up my recent article that's titled Octavia's First Afronaut, and I walk you through the impacts of that type of artificial intelligence that we see in Mind of My Mind. I'll walk you through how it shows up in Survivor. Okay, so after you read Survivor, the next book is Clay's Ark. It was written in 1984. This book kind of highlights what happens, and it picks up where Survivor is, which is why Survivor is so important. There is a disease that comes from space, right? It comes from space, and once it attaches itself to a human, it turns them into a hybrid being, half animal, half human. And these are known as the Clay Arks. The Clay Arks are in opposition and conflict with the Patternists in the series because of body difference and things of that nature. And so Clay's Ark opens up letting us know that there is some disease that has come from space that is now turning humans that are on Earth into hybrid bodies, half animal, half human. How does this virus get back, right? Well, the only people that have gone to space in Butler's universe at this point are in Survivor. And so that is why it narratively follows Survivor. And so as a result of the Clay Arks becoming an issue for the Patternists, who are, the telepaths or the brain hacking people, they go to war. The telepaths cannot read the Clay Ark mind because the Clay Ark mind is no longer human. The Clay Ark is actually faster. They have these animalistic instincts, and they could literally take out a Clay's Ark. And so they're at war. The fact that the war is starting to to kind of intensify because the virus is starting to spread. That is where Pattern Master, which is the last book of the series, but the first book that was ever written, begins to pick up. We are dead in the middle of a clay arc patternist war in Pattern Master. And we know that there is some type of economic devastation as a result of the clay arc disease going through LA, right? And so as a result of this economic devastation, Butler is beginning to set the scene for what people are returning to as her parable series. Now, the parable series consists of Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Talents, and she was starting to write Parable of the Trickster before she passed, but she never got to publish that text. Now, one reason that people started to return to the parable series is because of the first election of Donald Trump, and they were very commit arson. And people begin to force other people out of their walled communities and force them to survive on the streets of California. They're arguably dangerous. People are having to flee on foot because the natural fires, as well as the people are setting fires to kind of loot and steal. As a result of this, people are kind of forced into some type of work camps. The firefighters and the policemen are not necessarily helpful in the text, and they are running out of water. So one reason that people are turning their lens or turning their attention back to the parable series is because we have the re-entry of administration with MAGA. We have California under fire. But get this, y'all. This parable series starts to take place in what year does that say up there? 2024. The first journal entry by the protagonist was written July 20th, 2024. So Butler was a few months off from predicting or looking at these economic trends of the California fires and what the impacts would be if California did go under fire. So I think that that's a fascinating thing. Also, we see in Parable of the Talents, the religious evangelical right has risen under their new dictator-like president in the text. And we're looking at the return to forms of enslavement. There are wars starting to break out, civil wars. Doesn't that sound familiar? There are civil wars beginning to break out. The religious leaders are doing a lot in this book. They're doing a lot, and it is eerily scary, but Butler is kind of nodding to this present moment that we find ourselves in. And what's very interesting is the parable series, let me look at my notes, begins in 2024 and it ends around 2090. Right. And so this is the span of information that she's given us in the parable series, along with the protagonist trying to create another religion, the Earthseed religion. And so if you're interested in this present moment in culture, you can pick up this book. These are dense books. You will be reading for a moment, and you will probably be a little emotional. So after you read your Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, your next logical series to pick up is the Lilith's Brood series, which was also called the Xenogenesis Trilogy. And that contains Dawn, Adulthood Rights, and Imago. Now, I don't know if you can get this specific compilation, but I do know you can buy the standalone books off of Amazon. And so in your reading order, you want to read Dawn, Adulthood Rights, and Imago. Arguably, Dawn picks up where Parable of the Talents leaves off. And let me tell you how I know. If you do have this compilation, I want you to turn your book to page 37. On page 37, the protagonist Lilith, now they're in space. Earth, it was a war that broke out at the end of Parable of the Talents. People have gone on to space. We see these spaceships go ahead and launch at the end of Parable of the Talents. And now Dawn is picking up where we're seeing people in space and kind of encounter other forms of intelligence. And I call them other forms of intelligence as opposed to aliens because these beings in this text are not necessarily aliens. They are alien to the humans, but they are not necessarily aliens. They are gene traders. They are a different form of intelligence. But anyway, on page 37, Lilith makes a comment, and this is how I know Butler rewards her close readers. It's just one line. She says, There were humans who thought that way right up to the moment the missiles were fired. People who believed our space was our destiny. I believed it myself. Now, if you've read Parable series, you know that Laura and Olamina believed that the destiny of Earthseed was to take root where? Among the stars, go into space, and they launch into space. And on page 37, we have Lilith, who was rescued from Earth, admitting that there were people who believed that space was our destiny and that she had once believed it. And now she is in space. She is among another intelligence form. They have smart cities on this ship that she's on. They have print memories. They can do genetic modifications. They can slow down aging. They can create designer babies. We have data transfers. We have deep learning. We have so many artificial intelligence nods to this moment, and it starts 250 years later after the Parable series ends. So once you get through Dawn, then we have this rebirth or this new birth of human alien partnership or human intelligence partnerships, where now we have humanoids, we have the merging of genetic DNA with other chimera, which is already happening on Earth, if y'all didn't know. And then in Imago, we have this very, very futuristic society that kind of